Welcome to Blind Spots, a podcast where we're helping you fill the gap between what you want to do with your money and what you actually do. We are professional investors, writers, and financial planners helping you navigate the complexities of finance to optimize what you can control and cut out the rest. Join your host, Nick Shermans and Aaron Varghese, as we discuss the questions and nuances surrounding everyday money management.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Blind Spots. Today, as Nick says, we have some hot election talk for 2024. And as most people know, 2024 is an election year for the US. So whether you are on the right or the left, this tends to become an anxiety-driven time for many people. And it's not uncommon for clients to say, Nick, I'd love to hear how many times you think per week or per month you hear something along these lines. But I've heard a lot recently, I've got this sum of cash, I don't want to invest it until I know how the election turns out. Or these very bold statements like, I know that if X party is elected, then the markets are going to go down, or there's going to be a lot of volatility. Or they make big personal decisions like, I'm not going to retire if X person is elected. So we've got a lot of hot election talk to go through today. And I know that this is a personal favorite topic of yours. So I'm ready to unleash you on this.
Well, and I have to calm down. And this is not going to get political. So we're not going to talk about the merits of any candidate. I think that's beyond the scope of what this is about. But this topic was encouraged, one, as Aaron alluded to, the countless comments and feedback that we get during client meetings about what people are thinking. And it's heavy in politics. It always is. The noise gets really turned up in an election year. The second part of this was I saw a survey, and I'm going to read the results of this survey. It was conducted by Nationwide, which I believe is a large insurance company. And it surveyed investors, and 45% said the results of the 2024 presidential election will have a bigger impact on their retirement plans than market returns. The presidential election in 2024 will have a bigger impact on their retirement plan than market returns.
When you read that quote, how did that make you feel?
I'm going to try not to cuss, but I think people are just playing the wrong game. They're sucked into the noise. They're not paying attention to the right things. Okay, but there's more. A third of investors said they believe the U.S. economy will fall into a recession within 12 months if their preferred political party is not victorious. So I think you said something like ego, and that's an odd take. Like, you're operating your personal finances, your retirement plans in accordance with the way you think the world should work versus how it actually works. So
it's very predicated on your personal opinion.
So there's just a lot to unpack there. And again, I think people are just playing the wrong game. So our goal of this podcast is not to shame anybody. It's to recenter them, right? Yeah, I know elections can be exciting and they're on the news cycle 24/7 and everyone has an opinion. That's great. I want you to be passionate, patriotic, support your candidate. That's all good. But when emotion and some of these beliefs start to affect your finances, affect your retirement, I think that's where I get really worked up, because there's no empirical evidence to suggest whoever is sitting in the White House, left, right, middle, has any impact on future market returns. And I'm going back 100 years. Okay. So you can say, yeah, Nick, this one's different. Every election cycle feels like the biggest presidential election ever. And then a couple of years pass and people go on about their day. And like me personally, I've not as old as many investors or as some of our clients are, but I'm trying to think at any point, whoever was in the White House impacted my day-to-day life, right? It just doesn't. I mean, I get up, focused on my family, focused on the business, and I'm focused on what I can control. So I know that's easier said than done. People might shrug that off, but we've got a few anecdotes, a few pieces of information that might help you stay measured, stay balanced during a polarizing time.
Why don't you start with returns during presidential elections? Because many people, when they're talking about their preferred candidate, will say, if this person wins, markets are going to do X, Y, Z. So let's look at some
So
historical
before I
data.
get into the historical data, let's provide some high level context into what I personally think. This is my personal opinion about what's going on here. So in my opinion, I think COVID created a vacuum, right? We couldn't go out and do the things that we usually would be doing. We were all stuck inside watching TV or scrolling social media. I think that vacuum was taken up by politics. So people were all in on politics. It was a highly political time. And in general, human beings are tribal. We want to belong to something, right? We want to identify with groups, right? There's comfort in numbers. Like if you were a person on the Serengeti back in ancient times and you strayed from your tribe, you ended up getting eaten by a lion or killed by another tribe. So there's comfort in numbers. But there's unintended consequences of being tribal because we tend to take in or swallow the fire hose of beliefs of that group, right? Because it's difficult to have a different opinion. It's difficult to be an independent thinker. And a quote I saw online, and I'm sorry, I don't know who said this, but I think it's brilliant, and I think it speaks to the lack of independent thinking today, is if I share my opinion about one thing, like if I tell you my opinion on abortion, and you can guess from that opinion on abortion, and you can project or guess my opinion on what I think about the economy, what I think about immigration, that's a problem, right? That shows a lack of independent thought, but that's exactly what's gone on in this country. Someone shares one thing and you can pretty much predict about how they think about the market, what they think of the president, what they think of COVID. That is a problem. And it's more often than not the case when you're talking with anybody. So COVID vacuum, human beings' nature to be tribal, lack of independent thought, hearing your opinion on one thing and being able to identify your opinions on several other things. That's the overarching problem. And social media fuels all of this. Not having an information filter, what's noise, what's important, that all plays a part. So what was your question? Sorry, I went on a bit of a tangent.
No, that's good. So let's look at some historical data that you had a great quote from Warren Buffett in this blog post that said, if you mix politics with your investment decisions, you're making a big mistake. And a big reason for that is because history tells us that it doesn't matter who's sitting in the White House. Market returns don't really care. So tell us why that is.
Well, to unpack Buffett's quote, and there's many quotes like this, but investing is hard. You know, we saw that in 2022. You know, sometimes we think it's easy when markets are going up, but investing really is hard. And you don't want to make it more difficult by introducing emotion into the investment process. Emotion and investing do not mix. Emotion in politics certainly mix, and you don't want to introduce that into your finances. So that's the nature of, or that's the genesis of that comment. Now, zooming out and looking at every presidential election since 1928, okay? The average return during an election year for the S&P 500 is 11.28% per year. Okay, that's the average. Some years you're going to do better. Some years you're going to do worse. And I say year, I shouldn't say that. Some years the market's going to do better. Some years the market is going to do worse. Okay, but you might say, but what if this party gets in office? Or what if that party gets in office? Okay, I've got that too. If a Republican was elected, the average return, again, every election since 1928, 15.3%. If a Democrat was elected, average return, 7.6%. But if you want to forget all that, usually election years are pretty good. And there's all sorts of reasons why people think that is. I'm not going to get into that. Markets, economics are complex global systems. One of the things that frustrates me is when people ask, if candidate X gets elected, how do you think that's going to impact the market? I think that just shows a fundamental misunderstanding of how things work. Because if we know candidate X gets elected, we're assuming that we can isolate the impact of that candidate. When you isolate the impact of that candidate, we're assuming the millions of other variables, inflation, global trade, currency movement, interest rates, wars, are all fixed. Like we can freeze them in time just to isolate the impact of one candidate sitting in the White House. That's not how this works. You have a candidate in the White House, you have all these variables constantly changing. There's no way in hell you can isolate the impact of any candidate on the market. Okay. So zooming out, there's been 23 presidential elections since the S&P's inception. This is according to Morgan Stanley. 19 out of 23 years were positive. That's 83%. When a Democrat was in office and a new Democrat was elected, the total return for the year averaged 11%. Okay. When a Democrat was in office, which is the case now, and a new Democrat gets elected, total return for the year, 11%. When a Democrat is in office and a Republican gets elected, the total return for the year averaged 12.9%. So however way you cut this, election years are usually pretty good. One party is in office, that party wins again, people are fired up. The opposite party wins, people are excited for change. I don't know. Again, you can't isolate the impact, but know that it doesn't empirically hold up that the markets are going to tank because your candidate does not get elected.
Right, because there's probably roughly an equal amount of people on the other side of things that are saying
Well,
things.
it's very American of us to assume, and look, like the presidential election is important. I'm not trying to minimize that, but it's naive for us to assume that's the only game in town. Again, millions of other variables, global economy is more connected than ever. If something happens in Africa, like we're all going to know about it within 24 hours. So there's so many other variables
Yeah.
at play in a global, complex system. Now, one thing that does
go ahead.
happen, and this again goes back 30, 40 years, is there are some volatility in stock prices leading up to an election. So there is empirical evidence to suggest 90 days leading up to an election, stock prices might do a little bit of that up and down for those that aren't watching us. However, post-election, 3-6 months later, the volatility normalizes, meaning things get back to normal. Things get back to normal quickly. You know, and I get pushback from all this, like, Nick, but this time it's different. Well, going back to 1960, there's a chart that I included in the last blog that I wrote, and we'll link the blog in the description. But it shows every president since 1960, Democrat and Republican, and shows the S&P's return, or it just shows a graph of a dollar's growth over a period of 60 plus years. Okay. And I know you're probably rolling your eyes saying, Nick, this matters this time. Things are going to get weird. Look, I completely understand. I grew up in a political household. My dad watches the news cycle every single day. You know, we talk to a lot of people. And this is my overarching advice. One is, again, pay attention, support your candidate. That's what makes our country great. Like a fair vote, democracy, being able to elect someone to the highest office. That's all good. Start to pump the brakes when it leaks into your investment portfolio. Like if you're talking like, I want to wait and see before investing this money, what happens with the election, I think you've lost. Okay. My second point, and I've talked about some of this, is you can't isolate the impact of an election. So quit talking like, hey, if X candidate gets elected, what's the impact of the market? There's millions of other variables that are more important. Corporations, earnings, consumer behavior, interest rates, the Fed, inflation, all of that matters much, much more than who's sitting in the White House. The third thing is politics are loaded with emotion. Emotion and investing do not mix. If you find yourself, again, making decisions that are outside your scope of expertise or are charged with who you think is going to win or who you think is going to lose the election, you've lost. And then the last one, and I think this showed up in 2016, even if you know the outcome of the election, if someone told you beforehand, that doesn't mean the market is going to react the way that you think it should. I can't tell you how many people, and again, I'm not crediting the market's reaction to President Trump, but a lot of smart people said, if President Trump gets elected, the market was going to tank. Well, that didn't turn out to be true because markets seldom react the way that you think they should. And I think a lot of people operate with this assumption. They think the world market should operate with the way they think rather than how the world actually works. And if you catch yourself doing that, then you're going to keep making mistakes. You're going to keep getting frustrated. And again, these decisions to not invest money or to sell just because your candidate did not win are not free. There's a real cost. And I think you're doing yourself a disservice if you're not recognizing and reflecting on these poor decisions and these broken processes. You're going to keep making the same mistakes over and over again. So that's a lot of talking for me. We'll link the blog post If you've listened to nothing that I said and you think that I'm full of it, just know that politics and investing do not mix.
All right. That's a great reminder going into an election year. So if you have comments or feedback or questions, you can reach out to us at insight@pureportfolios.com, and we will see you in the next one.